Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hope you're doing well. So, I want to do part 2 of my thoughts on the Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin interview, which I found to be insightful, and I'm glad it was able to happen, even though establishment figures who are neoliberals and neoconservatives don't want it to happen, okay? But nonetheless, because X/Twitter is the last free speech, semi-free speech platform, we are able to hear the other side. No links to Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Now, he mentioned, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, that about sanctions, bombings, and pressure. That's how America does their foreign policy. I think this is quite accurate because there's the carrot and the stick method, right? Diplomacy, but we Americans do quite often have a sort of going guns blazing, as they say, like pressure and conquering and drone striking. Decimation is a very common tactic that we use. And so I found it to be quite accurate that he pointed that out. And sanctions is definitely something that it cripples an economy from underneath. So, very accurate to describe how we do that. And he mentioned it's counterproductive how America's foreign policy is. And I have noticed people like Scott Horton, who talk to people like Dave Smith, mention how disastrous America's foreign policy really is. And I do believe more Americans are waking up to how we just let our politicians do whatever they want in our name. And we didn't really hold them accountable. And they've made quite a lot of enemies. And in order to keep those enemies away, due to their behavior, they have to keep funding the industrial complex of the military. But as jobs go to AI and there's less tax money, they have to raise it on us, and this impoverishes us and creates more resentment. So the current foreign policy that our leaders enact seems to be unsustainable. Okay? And I'm glad that we are waking up to that fact. Sadly, though, Instagram announced, you can look this up, they will no longer be recommending political posts. It's really quite sad how America's election season, the liberals and the Democrats and the progressives decide that, they just want to keep you in the dark. That's quite strange. So they believe that they get to dictate, what you subscribe to, what you want to see. They shadow ban people, and then they say they're for democracy. But in order to have a functional democracy, you need informed voters. But it appears that they don't want people to hear both sides, and they want to just have a one-party narrative. And so it's not like Instagram is trying to help people make better foreign policy decisions or to inform the us Americans, about what we do and how our politicians make mistakes. So Putin voicing that is important for us to hear. Accountability for us as citizens. He mentioned how he had a good relationship with George W. Bush. It was not all about personality, but someone's mindset. He also mentioned how he had a good relationship with Trump. And so you begin to realize through history how long Putin's been in power and how we should find ways to just get along with Russia. That this manufactured narrative of the boogeyman that our government has used on us consistently is getting quite burnt out, when we have quite a bit more domestic problems that we should be concerned about. As he interestingly mentioned, our debt, border, stuff like that. So I think we should want a leader who will have good relationships with Putin, and at least functionality, professionalism, the fact that America Our nation has sent millions upon millions over there for a proxy war, while our own people suffer, is quite alarming. Quite alarming. And he pointed out how America has a domination at any cost mindset, and this is quite true. We do have that type of Americana vibe to us, where we want to dominate our enemies, and that's one reason why we have quite a lot of military movies, actions where it's like, who's the hero, and it's organized, it's structured, taking the male desire to dominate and putting it into military propaganda. It's a systemized, organized effect. There's nothing wrong with men wanting to dominate and to conquer, but I would argue, Mark Dice has pointed this stuff out, people have written a lot about it, that it's not done for the sake of art or for awakening the masculine mindset, but rather to keep filling the recruitment numbers for the banker wars. It's just a way to make those men feel hoorah when they enlist, to feel like heroes. Because if they don't feel like heroes, it's going to be harder to convince them to keep enlisting. But they need to, their strategy, foreign policy, and military stuff is domination. And as I have read the Gallic Wars, Sun Tzu, and I love reading about military history, and Khalid bin al-Walid, you want to dominate. But there is this dilemma of neglecting your roots, your people, and draining your funds. And can you take care of the wounded who come back? And the widows, and the orphans, and how that creates generational buckle, right? It's an interesting conversation, but how long can the domination effect last? That's a very serious conversation to be had. He also said oh yes, I mentioned that. Sanctions, restrictions, not being able to transact in dollars. Oh yes, so he mentioned how some of the punishments Russia has received was a large amount of restrictions and sanctions, and then not being able to do transactions in US dollars. SWIFT services being cut off from him, and sanctions against their ships that are bearing oil. Sanctions against their airplanes, and everywhere they have sanctions. So he contends Russia has received the most sanctions than any other place, and even under that pressure, he argues that Russia is one of the first economies, which shows the heart of them. It shows that the people of Russia aren't going to give up, but it also just shows the excessiveness, the pettiness, the viciousness. So not only is it like economic sanctions and using the US currency as a weapon, it's deep with putting weapons in Ukraine by the millions. You can begin to notice how he's really showing patience and leniency. That's what I'm getting from this. I started to notice how when we Americans have an honest look at ourselves, it's not easy to do. The nationalistic far-right Christians, they love the country. They're patriots, right? No doubt about it. But I do sometimes feel that they have a hard time seeing our mistakes. But there is a growing rise in libertarian mindsets, and some liberals actually, who they're wanting to change America's foreign policy. They want to be more isolationist, focus on domestic issues, and to be non-interventionist. So being a war hawk, warmongering, bloodthirsty regime in America is starting to really be more open. even though they block that out, right? They censor a lot of war coverage so that people don't begin to say, hey, we should stop it. In order to keep the funds going, Americans have to know what's going on with Taylor Swift and her stupid boyfriend, Super Bowl. It really is the bread and circuses so that they can keep going those wars on. I mean, the perfect example is what happened with Afghanistan. Americans couldn't tell you why we were there, and trillions are going on, and so many people made money off of the deaths of the Afghanistan people. We left there we dumped a bunch of weapons and pulled out terribly, and the Afghanistani people are in a famine. They didn't get like a Manhattan type of empire. They were left worse, and Americans have a hard time coping with that. I remember I posted that on LinkedIn and it actually got censored, and then I appealed it and it got put back. But the liberals and some of these people who see America as always the hero, like the right-wingers too, they have a very hard time with saying America did something wrong. Right? Because we have this sort of bald eagle effect that we have to swoop in and snatch the fishes out of the river, and we have to go first. We are the shining hill on the sea, and we got to do all this stuff. Like, we're the Atlantis. All that sort of mythology comes from that Wild West attitude of adventure and exploring and domination and winning. But there's no care afterwards for the mental health of the soldiers, or the healthcare of the widows, or the orphans. So it's quite lacking. It's one-sided. While the elites sit on the graves of the soldiers they sent to go die. So when Russia is pointing this out, like how we're being targeted, you can see, honestly, I feel we are the aggressors here. And it still isn't clear as in why Americans should hate Russians. Our nation calls us to hate a lot of people. I've noticed this. To hate Russians, to hate Iran, to hate China, to hate the Mexicans coming across the border, hate the people in Afghanistan. Like, we're always involved in wars. Funding wars, doing all kinds of stuff. It requires non-stop picking fights. It's really quite strange. Really quite strange. So, it would be nice if America, we could stop giving money to Ukraine, and Ukraine and Russia handle their own problems. It's strange. I just keep thinking that over and over. Why the average American's never even met a Ukrainian? How does that nation help us at all? You can look at the exports and the imports and you're like, okay. But learning about why we have to hate Russians, you're just like, I don't really get it. They're not communistic anymore. They're a market economy. And then when you see how Russia has good relations with China, we must ask ourselves as Americans, is it smart to piss off the entire Middle East, China and Russia and Iran at the same time? And remember I shared some community posts where people were saying we should invade Mexico because of the cartels and call the cartels terrorists, which means we'd be able to send troops to deal with terrorism because it would be like manipulated in a way in which we can militarize our border, and then we can do drone strikes in Mexico, and this would violate Mexico's sovereignty, and it wouldn't work out well for Mexico to allow the United States to just bomb and create civil chaos within their nation. Didn't work out well with Afghanistan. We have to keep looking at that. I reckon Afghanistan did not become stronger because of America's help in fighting terrorism. So, why would Mexico trust America's strategizations with the cartels? Especially when Americans consume the vast amount of drugs. Americans love drugs. They can't stop getting high. So as long as there's a customer, there's going to be a market. So we just had to get people to stop using drugs, not invade Mexico. But Russia's pointing out our behavior as Americans, dominate at all costs, how he feels our activity is counterproductive, just extreme pressure. And we don't even really know why the average American, if you ask them, why should we hate Russia? Yes, there can only be one at the top of the pyramid, but every empire has its rise and fall. Can America sustain itself by, like, if you see the social rot, America's on the brink of civil war. So how can America, if it's on the brink of civil war, fund a war with Iran, Russia, and China, while giving money to Israel to bomb Gaza? How is that feasible? That all means the American must be taxed more, less money for the worker, longer hours for the worker. The elites will find loopholes, tax havens, and then the American tax dollars will go towards expanding the government, which means they'll live off of our money and we'll have less and less and less. So he has a point. That's not really working. We think we're hurting them, but we're hurting us in a really true sense way. And a lot of people don't want to hear that. Apparently that, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want us to know either. He also mentioned how dragging Ukraine into NATO is all about pressure and asks why. I don't see, any really good come from NATO. It's really a strange way of behaving. Ukraine is like a pawn, and I find that to be very apparent now. If you know that NATO is a force, if America had to trade places with Russia, you would see something very different. So that's why I just noticed the hypocrisy. America will never allow military bases so close to it. I don't think it would. So I really do feel bad for Ukraine. People who try to chisel up Russia. Oh yes, so he mentioned further how there are people who they are breaking apart the region into these mini factions. Okay? And I want you to remember what we discussed in the Federalist Papers, how a Confederate situation versus a really solid union is weaker, okay? And how we're called the United States, not the divided states, and that we're united under the federal government, and we don't want states to secede and go rogue and try to take over and all that a solid force, not broken Confederates like what happened to the tribes. They each had their own chiefs, they had these confederacies. The Americans came in, they were totally unified, and well, they weren't Americans at the time. Called them frontiersmen, pilgrims, colonists, westward expansionists, you name it. They were united in their goal to want to stay there and take land and eradicate the tribes, okay, and push Christianity. The tribes were not united in that way. They were taken out. In cultures you'll hear throughout history, the divided nations are easier to pick apart rather than a really solid, united territory under a great leader. And so when he points out there are people who want to chisel up Russia, balkanization, factionalism, civil strife, he's right. That is a military strategy. And no doubt that there's people who want to do that to Russia. He mentioned subduing the quasi-states in a divided form to use their combined potential for the future struggle with China, a mistake. So if you have a bunch of quasi-states, they're all divided, and you can't garner their potential, that's going to be quite difficult to deal with, right? I'm going to pause this 1 second. I need to get a tissue. Take it back. Now, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. He mentioned further the economy of Indonesia, and I didn't really know that Indonesia's economy is doing that great, but if Putin is mentioning it, it must be quite significant. He also talked about how Zelensky's dad fought against the Nazis in World War II. Didn't know that. That's very informative. Wow. He pointed out further that Zelensky is supporting the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, while his dad fought against fascism and was a frontline soldier. And he's asking him why, why would you do that? And he enlightened us by pointing out that Zelensky ran on bringing peace to Ukraine, and that's why he was elected. But Putin points out that Zelensky realized, once he was actually elected, that it's better to not upset the neo-Nazis and the nationalists because they are aggressive and very active. That is an astute observation, because it is true, America has some people who are like clones of a Nazi ideology. I do believe there's one that is from Greek origins called the Golden Dawn, and I remember some people when I was in college talking about the Golden Dawn, and they didn't know I'm mixed raced. They presumed I'm just white, and they didn't know that I really like Latinos. Like, my children are half Mexican. I've never dated a white man. I'm like Latino community. The Mexicans is like, those are my homies, right? And all my siblings are half black, except for one is half Cuban. So we're not a pure, we're not Anglo-Saxon, right? But I guess they thought I was, and I think they were hinting at me to join something called the Golden Dawn, which is like a I think it's like a neo-Nazi fascist. It's something like that, right? Because I'm part Italian and Cherokee, so maybe they thought, Greek, Macedonians, and Italians, they're very close with each other in culture, so maybe they invited me. But I was just like, no, I didn't go for it. And then I told someone else about it, and then they were like, really? And they seemed very enthusiastic to join. So, that's real. And if there's Black Power organizations, Brown Pride, which is the Mexicans, Puerto Rican Pride, Dominican Pride, I don't get bothered with white supremacists, but because they don't like people like me, they don't like people like me, and they don't like mixed race children. So I mean, they're not my friends, but they have their little white pride, and I don't see them as important. But clearly they do exist in America, except everything is called white supremacy now, so everything is racist now, due to the woke journalism. So it's you can't really see the true trees through the clouds because of the fogginess of bad journalism, and the sky is falling leftists, so you're not able to combat, and there's a lot of anti-whiteism, extreme anti-whiteism. So there's more anti-white sentiments than I'd argue whites hating on mixed race people or just any other race. So there's that. But my point is just to make it clear that the nationalists and the neo-Nazis, it's true, they are very aggressive and active. They're just very energetic. It's like the liberal soy boy stereotype. Effeminate guys like Vosh and Destiny. Like Kyle Kalinske, he's a liberal, but when he got married to Crystal Ball, he started changing, bleached his hair. Like, he has a total different energy and he's a little bit more beaten down by the heel, so he's not as masculine. I would say Jimmy Dore is probably the only guy who's like a old school liberal, kind of hit him with the punches, right, type of thing. So there's stereotypes that are universal, I'd argue. Yes, there's exceptions. But Putin is not wrong when he points out that upsetting a large amount of hardcore nationalists and neo-Nazis is not the best idea. So he contends Zelensky gave in to the demands of the nationalists and neo-Nazis. But by doing so, he actually created a problem that Russia felt it had to solve. So it is undeniable, in my opinion, that Ukraine is more soft on the neo-Nazis than Russia would be. And if America is calling everything neo-Nazis in our land, and they are, pushing new laws of censorship for it, like there's this group called the Groypers, the little frog people. They're really aggressive, extremely trolly, but they have their race politics, right? They get censored on every app, so they're not allowed to congregate, and they're very aggressive in their trolling campaigns, and they never get tired of creating sock accounts, stuff like that. So if you're gonna punish your domestic neo-Nazis but fund neo-Nazis abroad, I find that to be counterproductive. I really do. But there's a lot of nuance here. He contends Boris Johnson told Ukraine to not make peace, and Boris Johnson, I saw, made a video where he's denying that. But it would be potent to see the truth. What's the truth of the matter? Putin and Boris Johnson, they're going to know the truth on that. But this is why having a good advisor is important. So you can see that Ukraine is getting a lot of bad advice. It would be smarter for them to submit to Russia, I'd argue. They have such a close culture with the Russians, far closer than they do with England or America or Canada. How long can America keep funding the war? Is America going to help Ukraine to rebuild? Why is it the American taxpayer's job to fund destruction and not actually like building water wells and more productive things? It's a good question to be had. He also talked about Eastern Orthodoxy in Russia, that Christian faith. I found that to be enlightening. Mentions the one big family, the motherland, the family, the multiculturalism in terms of various religions in Russia. So I liked how he did not attack Islam, and he didn't attack Christianity. And I know he has a history in Syria with Bashar al-Assad. That's not my wheelhouse. I have no idea. But I'm just pointing out here is that he wasn't saying Muslims are like an evil threat that should be killed and taken away. France hates Muslims, the UK really hates Muslims, and America hates Muslims. So I think he was showing us, Muslims in the West, like, Russia won't hate you just because of your faith, right? Russia is a home to many religions, and that you should care about Russia because you live there, and you should want to maintain it. He seemed very inclusive, which is kind of funny, right? I found that to be enlightening. That was a smart move by him, because liberals are all about inclusivity and multiculturalism, whereas the neo-Nazis are not, right? So a liberal will hate Putin because he invaded and violated that sovereignty of Ukraine or whatever, but Russia took back Ukraine to push back NATO, which caused NATO countries to start the bandwagon of sanctions and bombings and terrible foreign policy and pressure, and then told Ukraine to keep up a war they couldn't win and kept supplying them and draining the pockets of the tax dollars of the coffers, right? It's interesting. So the American liberal who wants multiculturalism at home is helping to destroy Russia, a place that has diverse religions, and Ukraine attacks the Orthodox Church and isn't as welcoming to Muslims and has a neo-Nazi faction. So he's pointing out some plain facts, and it is true. The New York Times, Rolling Stone, places like that, Time Magazine, establishment outlets that are not honest, they're going to work double time to hide that fact, and The Guardian will write more articles and other strange things. But Tucker Carlson did a great thing by letting us hear the other side, and I would argue that those who are wise will see the error of our ways and think about, maybe we should tell Ukraine to sue for peace, because our money should be spent here helping our own people. Should not be spent on that, more wars. We have to be more aggressive in how our politicians spend our money. And I think that's why so many of the establishment does not want, they didn't want anyone to talk about Putin. They were censoring and banning people outright because they want to keep the train going. They want to keep the banks funding that and taking all of our money. It's really quite clear. Further, he talked about the strength of Russian patriotism and how these people love their country, their motherland, and they're going to fight to the end. I have to say, I've always heard this stereotype about the Russian people, and even in movies and stuff, Russians were always depicted as a very strong people because of the snow. They are strong in that way. Drinking vodka and wrestling bears, people. They have that stereotype, and it's proven to be quite true. Very few stereotypes of Ukrainians even exist in the American mind because no one really paid attention to Ukraine. But Russia has a huge history that more Americans have classically within their mind. And it would do good to help Russia to have peace. I also think there is a bit of wanting to destroy white nations. Something about the Russians who are blue-eyed and blonde-haired, that maybe they're the last. The Swedes are not known for being strong. The Finnish of Finland, Denmark, Norway, those are very effeminate men. They don't have that Icelandic, strong vibe anymore of a pagan Viking, right? Russia still has that stereotype of strength, of white male heterosexual masculinity based off the Christian faith. Because for example, when you destabilize a country, take out its patriotism, you take out its archetypes. So for America, it used to be that cowboy culture, or the smooth talking black man who has it's like molasses. He's got this sort of panther-esque, very smoothness that was destroyed and replaced with mumble rap, trap rap. So you can destroy a healthy example for young people to look up to, and then putting up a worse thing, and you can destroy an entire culture, right? So I do believe that there's a project going on that it's already worked in America. This is why you have a revivalism of paganism going on in America amongst white men, because they want to have an image of a strong white man for them to look up to, which I don't see anything wrong with that. If you want to, everybody has a cultural icon, right, that they want to look up to. So it's okay, that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. But Russia seems to be the last, at least stereotypical, well-known white male area. Gender roles, not very woke, strong in the snow, hardy, very able, able to endure high amounts of suffering. They have a culture that hasn't been destroyed by Hollywood yet, that I know of, right? Maybe they have, but it's just not as known, maybe. But him talking about the patriotism of Russians, I think is quite astute. And there's something to there, because I still can't figure out why our politicians really want to make us hate the Russians. You know, I don't get it. He also mentioned the Roman Empire and how the barbarian strength was, how the downfall of Rome, it was slower than the pace today. He's basically pointing out the acceleration process, how an empire can fall faster today due to technology, transfer of information, disease, weaknesses, you name it. This is quite true. As the Romans became more decadent, barbarians becoming stronger, they take you out. And Biden is the pinnacle example of decadence and someone who did not deserve to be the leader, someone who was mentally incapable, and how the media covered up. You know, I don't like Gavin Newsom at all, but they should have run Gavin Newsom instead of Biden. But they chose an old school bumbling buffoon who's out of touch, and it don't make no sense, right? Unless you see it as a sort of demoralization agenda. Because I don't, like, George W. Bush was, there was great memes about him, you know, but you didn't feel as much shame. Biden brings a lot of shame. Having a dementia-ridden, feeble, delicate, frail leader who falls off his bicycle, falls up the stairs of Air Force One. And he even had this clip where he said, "My butt's been wiped." And you're like, what? What is going on? And they try to hide. And you're like, this is absolutely crazy. And so, that kills patriotism. Your leader, if he's ineffectual, can kill patriotism. But Putin is still lucid, strong, been there for a while. So you could have more patriotism when you're behind a strong male leader versus a feeble, ice cream eating leader like Biden. If you want to have an old man be your leader, he has to be full of wisdom. There's no wisdom from Biden. And so, who will be the Americans' barbarian is the question. That's why I think it's important to talk about peace, because America can't go starting a bunch of fires and thinking that we will never have the chickens won't come back home to roost. But that takes a lot of honest discussion, which people like Facebook and YouTube don't want us Americans to have. And some people lack the patience for such serious conversations. He also had a funny line where he said no one can stop Elon Musk, and concerning the brain chip. He talked about AI and genetics is like the expansion of gunpowder. So once gunpowder came onto the scene, it really changed the landscape. This is very apparent because the Native Americans, and they did not have guns. When the colonists showed up, they had guns. They started trading, and then the tribes got guns, but it was too little too late, right? Gunpowder really changed warfare. So genetics and artificial intelligence will change our landscape as well, as did gunpowder. I found that to be a very informative perspective. He said essentially that there will need to be international agreements on AI and genetic research, similar to how when there was nuclear powers, they're like, hey, we can see the damage potential that nuclear power can do, so we gotta regulate that and hope to come together. But as we have seen in Gaza, that doesn't really work. I don't think the UN or the world's coming together will do anything, really. But who knows? He mentioned Tucker Carlson, he mentioned Edward Snowden. So Edward Snowden, he contends Putin, right, was caught red-handed with materials, and that he had classified information that it was secret, and if you have that type of information, that's espionage. So he said, yeah, he was a journalist, but he was given secret information, so it's by definition it is espionage. And further, he went on to say, it seemed kind of scary to be like, will you trade in Snowden for someone and give him back to the United States? That sounds pretty scary. I wouldn't want to be Edward Snowden, man. What a scary situation to be in. But Edward Snowden, I don't think he did something evil. But man, the corrupt elite want to get him. He also pointed out that Ukraine is a satellite state of the USA, and I think that's quite clear by now. And one of the last things he pointed out was Boris was acting on behalf of the Biden administration to tell Ukraine not to seek a peace deal with Russia. We mentioned that earlier, but it is quite clear how we Americans really do need to update ourselves on Ukraine, but we have a pattern developing, and that is America will gladly fund other people's problems, but those people don't fund our problems. I find this to be strange. Millions to Gaza. I mean, to bomb Gaza, right? To Israel. Millions to Ukraine. What does Israel give us back? They say separation of church and state, but then the religion is used. Oh, well, Judeo-Christian values, therefore give us your tax money. Oh, we run your banking operation in Hollywood, and if you don't do what we say, we're going to punish your country because we're all in positions of power and we're in CEOs, but if you talk about that publicly, we're going to ruin your life and debank you. Which proves our point, but if you actually prove our point, which we're proving right now, you're going to get censored in your platform, call you anti-Semite, so give me your money. And it's like, what? I think when you just, as we Americans, take a step back and say, why do we want to fund a genocide? Why is it our problem what happens over there? Why do our politicians, but you can't have these conversations when it comes to Israel, right? But what I'm just pointing out is the foreign aid. So America will dish out our money by the billions to other countries, and then tell our own people, kick rocks, while pushing social decay on us. Seems like a very organized, constructed demolition and balkanization of the country. And you have to wonder, those who want to save America and make it better, they have to be able to have honest conversations, but you see how the social media platforms prevent that. And then you see further how the phones we buy and what apps you can install also controls that. The operation of bots, shadow bannings, it's a huge new field of warfare. And if we're to have peace with Russia and have our money go towards our own homeland, we're going to have to do some deep introspection. We're going to have to look into the black mirror and figure out where we went wrong, what we can do better, and how we can turn the ship around. And if we can't do that, we can at least talk about it, but we have to find a way to survive. So when you see people like in the video game The Last of Us, it's really made quite an impression on me, that game. I would just like to point out how it's like scavenging, looting, different factions fighting against each other, right? We all have to look in our own little families and say, how will we survive? Know your landscape, where you can hunt, different plants, where your food banks are. What would you do in a bank freeze? Do you know how to travel without the GPS and with old-fashioned map? Do you know how to stay warm? Like how to purify water? Because the collapse that we have will require intelligence. Because Putin has pointed out the unsustainability of American foreign policy. And I do believe Americans are starting to look behind the curtain as the boomer generation fades. Because see, with the old-fashioned TVs, you were only given one perspective from the talking heads. The Bill Maher generation is over. Streamers and independent journalists have risen and created a new renaissance of information. Yes, that has also fake news and controlled opposition, but people now can create a public square and create niche communities. And this has revolutionized honest conversations around war that the establishment does not like. And it's up to people to figure out how do you survive once your own government leads it to destruction. We have to look at how people across the world in Yemen, different parts of Africa, Somalia, you just gotta look and say, like, how did they get by? How are they getting by? And we have to look at our natural resources within our country and say, if our grandchildren have to survive in the landscape where America is now the oppressed one, how do we endure? How do we keep going? Because America was ethnically cleansed earlier, right? So the tribes were here. They didn't really have anything going on with their borders, and Christians kept showing up, and they kept being more passive, and they lost. The red man is almost non-existent in America. There's not too many left, right? So cultures of America can change, and they has changed. Okay, we have so many different cultures here, so that is important for us to recognize in terms of patterns, right? China, India, they got ancient cultures. America is not that way. It's changed quite a lot in just 500 years. So what we can do is, while our leaders are draining our tax dollars and the pinch is becoming tighter on food, healthcare, education, and our streets are getting worse and gangs are rising up, one must choose the good path and to survive and thrive, and understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us and will test us, and to think about the time of Moses, when Fir'aun was oppressive, and where it said, babies were thrown into the Nile. You think about when there was Sodom and Gomorrah, just so much wickedness and perversion. These cycles continue, and we have to think, how do we survive? And with the rise of AI, there'll be just a new form of oppression. So the people who are really well versed in robotics and artificial intelligence, I'm sure those younger generations will find a way to get around that. But it requires the people creating their own communities and parallel societies in order to survive while the empires battle it out in the sky. Right? It's like flying carriages. Like, imagine, it's like we're sitting here gardening, reading, playing with our kids, and above us are all these dragons just fighting it out, and debris is falling from the sky, and we can't really escape it. We have to find a way to survive it. So, with nuclear weapons and, artificial intelligence and America poking bears and stuff like that, it's, the whiplash will fall upon us. One prominent example is in Gaza. The people who had nothing to do with what Hamas did were targeted, and the people of Israel were targeted as well. So the tit for tat will continue. So you have to find, how do you survive? How do you migrate? How do you secure your family? I, for one, me and my family, we will, inshallah, If America gets bad, we will go to Mexico. Rising economy. In the jungle, where we can live and thrive and farm and hunt and fish. So, and be away from woke culture. So, inshallah, that's our backup plan. 5-hour flight. Plus a drive into the jungle where our home is being built. But, something to think about. Something to think about. And so, survive and thrive. I keep thinking of the examples of an apocalyptic situation of like The Last of Us, minus the zombies, just the scarcity, the dysfunction and decay, and then looking at Earth as sort of like the planet Pandora and Avatar. It's a hostile Earth. There is beauty, but there's hostility. So you need to be safe and have a security mindset. And you don't know when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to claim you, bring you back to return to Him. So you do the best you can every day. Avoid wickedness. Avoid turning into the monster. But you still have to not be naive. Have to prepare. And not just live for the goal that I mentioned in my last video. Don't just live as if you're gonna reach the end of everything you ever wanted. Plenty of people across the world had a plan and it didn't come to fruition, and Russia and Ukraine are a prime example of destabilization and economic hardship, and lots of widows, orphans, and single moms. Therefore, it's incumbent upon us as believers to know Allah can test us, and we must do our best to survive and thrive, not to be paranoid, but not to be naive. Hopefully, America, our nation, can do better. Let me know what you think in the comments. What was your favorite part of the interview? What did you learn? What value did you find from it? And if you'd like to join my blog and support the channel, it's www.subscribestar.com/MilahanArchive. Hope to see you there.